The smell of smoke, it still hangs in the air. A bitter reminder of the flames that licked at his home. They figured fire could burn out his resolve, that shattered windows and a beating would break him. They were dead wrong. This land? It's more than just dirt and trees. It's a legacy, paid for in sweat, defended for generations. And for one old soldier, it's the last piece of ground he'll ever give up. Arthur Jenkins, 72 and still sharp, knew the earth of his farm like the back of his hand, just as he once knew the cold steel of a rifle. His family's land, a sprawling 100 acres of Pennsylvania woods and fields, wasn't just property. Oh no, it was the living story of his family. His great-granddad cleared it. His granddad farmed it. His own father fought off a different kind of takeover, a highway they wanted to ram through, one that never saw the light of day. Now it was Arthur's watch. This land was his peace. The one place where the ghosts of a long-ago war in some distant jungle finally went quiet. Here, under the shade of ancient oaks his family planted, he found a quiet the world outside just didn't offer. The creek's murmur, the rustle of leaves, a hawk's far-off cry, those were the sounds that had replaced the hell of battle. This land was where he healed, where he remembered, and where he planned to take his last breath. But peace, well, it has a habit of not lasting. The Horizon Development Group, a giant in the world of urban sprawl with an appetite as big as its portfolio, had its eyes on Arthur's land. Their dream wasn't of whispering pines and rich soil, but of a massive shopping center, a concrete paradise of stores, a multiplex, endless parking lots, and fast food joints. It promised profit, maybe even some jobs, but for Arthur, it was a death sentence for everything he cherished. He'd met their type before, smooth talkers in pricey suits, armed with glossy pictures and empty promises. They looked at him and saw an old man, maybe a lonely one, an easy mark. They didn't see the steel in his spine, forged in fires they couldn't even begin to imagine. It started on a crisp autumn afternoon. A fancy black sedan, looking completely out of place on Arthur's gravel driveway, crunched its way up to the farmhouse. Two men got out, oozing a kind of forced friendliness. Mr. Henderson, a bit plump and already sweating in the cool air, was the main man. His younger sidekick, a Mr. Davies, was all sharp edges and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They called it a community enhancement project, talked about progress, about bringing good times to the area. Their first offer? It was a lot of money, enough to make most folks think twice. They spread their shiny architectural drawings out on Arthur's worn kitchen table, the gleaming, sterile future trying to cover up the warm, scarred wood underneath. Arthur listened, his eyes steady, his face giving nothing away. He'd faced down men far more dangerous than these two could ever hope to be. When they finally finished their pitch, their smiles full of expectation, Arthur's answer was quiet, but absolute. "This land," he said, his voice a bit raspy but solid as oak, "is not for sale. Not now. Not ever. It's my home. It was my father's home, and his father's before him." He nodded towards a faded photo on the wall. A serious-looking fella in a World War I uniform, standing proud on this very land. Some things just don't have a price. Henderson's smile twitched, then vanished, replaced by a flash of irritation. Davies's smile just got tighter. They tried again, upping the offer, talking about an annuity, about the legacy he could leave. A money legacy, of course. Arthur just shook his head. "My legacy is in the soil, gentlemen, not in your bank vaults." The developers left that day, barely hiding their frustration. They were used to getting what they wanted. An old man on a piece of land, no matter how much he loved it, was usually just a question of finding the right price. Arthur Jenkins, they were starting to see, wasn't usual. The polite visits soon turned into registered letters. Pages full of legal talk about zoning, public good, how their project was just meant to be. They even hinted about eminent domain, even though they weren't building a public road, but a private shopping mall. The letters were meant to scare him, to crush an old man under the weight of laws and corporate might. Arthur wasn't a lawyer, but he knew intimidation when he saw it. He'd seen it used as a weapon of war. He took the letters to a small-town lawyer, Sarah Hughes, a young woman whose granddad had served with Arthur in the same unit. She read them, her brow creased with worry. "They're trying to bully you, Arthur," she said. "They think you'll get scared and just give in." "Scaring me," Arthur said with a grim little smile, "is a bit tougher than they think. This isn't just about me, Sarah. It's about what's right." For Arthur, this land was more than just property. It was part of who he was, a testament to everything he and his family had built and endured. Losing it wasn't an option. Sarah agreed to help, knowing they were a tiny David against a huge corporate Goliath. The first legal shots were fired. Cease and desist letters went back and forth. Horizon Development was clearly getting annoyed. Their precious timeline was being messed up. Their profits were being threatened by one stubborn old man. When the legal threats and polite requests didn't move Arthur Jenkins, the air around his farm began to change. It was subtle at first, then it grew into something you couldn't ignore, something menacing. Horizon Development's tactics shifted from the fancy boardroom to the quiet backroads. It started with whispers in Harmony Creek, the nearby town. All of a sudden, Arthur, a man known for his quiet strength and wartime service, was the talk of the town, and not in a good way. He was an eccentric old hermit, some folks started saying, just holding back progress that would help everybody. Others whispered he was going senile, a crazy old man who didn't know what was good for him or anyone else. These weren't just random chats. They were little seeds of trouble, planted carefully by someone hiding in the shadows. Store clerks who used to greet him with a warm smile now seemed hesitant, their own smiles strained. Old friends would just nod quickly and hurry on by, not meeting his eye. It was a deliberate campaign to make him feel alone, an outsider in his own town, hoping the loneliness would break him. Then came the petty harassment, the kind that's hard to pin on anyone but designed to wear you down. His mailbox got vandalized, not once, but 3 times. First dented, then knocked clean off its post, and finally smeared with grease. Late-night phone calls started with just silence or muffled laughter on the other end before the line clicked dead. Classic moves to make you feel watched, uneasy. But Arthur, he was a man who'd survived weeks of enemy patrols in places where every shadow could mean death. He just repaired his mailbox each time, his jaw tight. He started sleeping lighter, that old soldier's instinct, buried for years, waking up. He put a new, stronger lock on his front door and walked his property line every morning and every evening. He knew this was just the beginning. One morning, he found the tires of his old pickup truck slashed. All 4 of them. This was a clear step up, from nuisance to real damage, trying to trap him, to leave him stranded. He reported it to the local sheriff, a man named Brody, who'd known Arthur his whole life. Brody listened, took notes, but his eyes had this tired, resigned look. "Arthur," Brody sighed, "I've got a good idea who's behind this. But proving it? That's a whole other ball game. These development companies, they've got layers of people to hide behind. They hire, well, let's just say contractors, third parties, impossible to trace." He promised to look into it, but Arthur got the real message. The local law, whether they didn't care, were scared, or just outgunned, weren't going to be much help. It was tough, even for a man as strong as Arthur. Sleep became a thing he rarely got, startled awake by the smallest sound. The peace of his land was now spoiled by a constant nagging worry. He found himself scanning the tree line more often, his hand sometimes drifting to where a weapon used to sit. Old memories, the unwelcome kind, started bubbling up more. The sudden jolt of an ambush, the chilling snap of a twig in the dark jungle. The here and now was dredging up the past, making the harassment hit even harder. He thought of his wife, Martha, gone now for years. She had loved this land as much as he did. It was her garden that still pushed out a few stubborn roses each summer, her favorite rocking chair still on the porch. Thinking of her, of their life here, just made him dig his heels in deeper. He wasn't just defending land, he was defending memories, love, and a promise he'd made to her to look after this place. The developers, or whoever they were using, were testing him, looking for a weak spot. They wanted him to feel cut off, scared, and helpless. They wanted him to think that fighting was pointless, that their progress was coming no matter what, and would just roll right over him. What they didn't get was that Arthur Jenkins had been through fires much hotter than any they could light, or so he thought. The fight was a long way from over. It was about to get a whole lot uglier. The slashed tires, that was just a warm-up. The campaign to scare him off, no longer happy with just whispers and small-time vandalism, took a much darker turn. Horizon Development, or the shadowy folks they had on their payroll, decided to really turn up the heat. One blistering July afternoon, while Arthur was in town getting supplies, a tougher trip now since he was using an old bicycle until he could get his truck tires fixed, he came home to a scene of pure, calculated destruction. His vegetable garden, the one he tended so carefully, his source of food and peace, was wiped out. Plants were torn up, vegetables smashed, the neat rows turned into a muddy mess. Even worse, some kind of thick, nasty chemical had been sprayed all over everything, poisoning the soil. The message couldn't have been clearer. Nothing you care about is safe. This wasn't random. It was personal, meant to crush his spirit. Seeing that garden hit Arthur harder than the slashed tires. That garden was a link to Martha. She'd taught him the joy of bringing life out of the earth. It was his small act of creation in a life that had seen way too much destruction. Standing there, breathing in the chemical stink over his ruined plants, a cold anger started to build inside him, an intensity he hadn't felt in years. He carefully took pictures of the damage before he started cleaning up, his movements slow and deliberate, his anger a tight, coiled spring. He reported this too, of course. Sheriff Brody came out again, his face even grimmer this time. "This is getting worse, Arthur. These people, they're pros at this kind of persuasion." He warned Arthur to be careful, even hinted that maybe, just for his own safety, he should think about the developer's offer again. Arthur's eyes, hard as stone, met Brody's. "Reconsider? Sheriff, they just declared war on my wife's memory. There's no reconsidering. There's only the fight." The nights got longer, heavier with tension. Arthur started sitting on his porch late into the evening, a big Maglite flashlight beside him, his old hunting rifle, cleaned and oiled, resting just inside the door. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to be caught off guard either. He was a soldier, and the first rule was to know your enemy and guess their next move. He knew they'd see his defiance as a challenge. The first direct physical threat wasn't far behind. He was fixing a fence at the far end of his property, near the woods that bordered an access road the developers had started to survey. An unmarked pickup truck with tinted windows rumbled to a stop. Two men got out, not Henderson or Davies. These guys were rougher, with cold eyes and not much to say. "Mr. Jenkins," one of them called out, his voice flat, no hint of politeness. "Heard you're being a bit stubborn about this land." Arthur straightened up slowly, his hand gripping the handle of his fencing tool. "Heard you're trespassing," he shot back, his voice just as cold. "This land's gonna be developed, old man, one way or another," the second man said, stepping closer. He was taller, bigger, with a nasty scar running down his jaw. "You can take the money and walk away easy, or you can make it hard on yourself." "I'm not going anywhere," Arthur said flatly, his gaze locked on them. "This is my property. I suggest you leave." The scarred man let out a dry chuckle. "Getting brave in your old age, are we?" He took another step, deliberately getting in Arthur's space, trying to use his size to intimidate. What happened next was fast. The man shoved Arthur, a hard, nasty push. Arthur stumbled back, but his instincts, those old combat reflexes he thought he'd forgotten, kicked in. He didn't go down. Instead, he used the push, pivoted, and swung the heavy fencing tool in a short, sharp arc. It connected with the man's knee. The man yelped, a sharp sound of pain and surprise, and staggered back, his tough guy act gone. His buddy, stunned for a second, started to move forward, but Arthur was already shifting, putting himself between them and his fence line. The tool held ready. "I said, get off my land," he repeated, his voice now a low growl. There was something in his eyes, a flash of the soldier he used to be that made them stop. They hadn't expected a fight, especially not from an old man. Muttering threats, the injured one leaning on his friend, they backed off to their truck and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a nasty feeling in the air. Arthur stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding, adrenaline pumping through him. He was shaken, not by fear, but by the return of a part of himself he thought was buried deep. He'd defended himself, but he knew this was just an appetizer. They'd tested him with vandalism, then with a direct physical threat. Each time he'd pushed back, each time he knew they'd push harder. The stakes were going up, and the smell of real danger was thick in the air. The fight for his land was quickly turning into a fight for his life. That showdown at the fence line, it was a turning point. The developers and the thugs they hired now knew Arthur Jenkins wasn't some frail old man who'd just fold under pressure. He'd fight back. This didn't stop them. It just made them meaner. They decided it was time for a message that couldn't be missed. A message of fire and fear. Arson. It was a cruel, classic move in these kinds of disputes to force someone out. It happened on a moonless night, a few weeks after the fence line fight. Arthur had been extra careful, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. He was asleep in his bed, the old farmhouse quiet, when that sharp, acrid smell of smoke first hit his nose. It was a smell he knew all too well, a smell that yanked him from sleep with an icy shot of alarm. He was out of bed in a flash, his mind still fuzzy with sleep, racing. He moved through the dark house, every sense on high alert. Peering through the kitchen window, his blood ran cold. The old barn, a historic building that had been on the property for over 100 years, was engulfed in flames. Fire leaped high into the night sky, a terrible orange against the black, eating up the dry old wood with terrifying speed. The barn wasn't just a building, it was full of memories. His father's old tools, his grandfather's antique farm equipment, even a few things he'd treasured from his own younger days. All of it was now being swallowed by a fire that was deliberately set. His training kicked in. First thought, contain it, keep himself safe. He called the fire department, his voice tight but controlled, giving his location clearly. Then, grabbing his rifle and a powerful flashlight, he carefully slipped out of the house, not towards the barn, but circling, checking the shadows around his home. Were they still out there, watching? Was the house next? The distant wail of sirens got closer. Firefighters arrived and they fought hard, but it was too late to save the ancient barn. They managed to stop the blaze from spreading to the nearby woods, or, most importantly, to Arthur's house, but the barn itself was gone. As dawn broke, it showed a smoking, charred ruin, a gaping wound on the land. Sheriff Brody was there, his face tight with anger and frustration. "This wasn't an accident, Arthur," he said, his voice heavy. "We found traces of accelerant. They meant to burn it to the ground." Arthur nodded, his face grim, streaked with soot, his eyes reflecting the smoldering embers. He'd expected them to escalate, but seeing it, the sheer nerve of the arson, was still a shock. He felt deeply violated, a hot burning anger, but also a strange, steely calm settling over him. This was it. They had crossed a line. There was no going back. In the days that followed, as the smell of burnt wood hung heavy in the air, something inside Arthur shifted. The fear, the anxiety that had been his constant shadow, didn't vanish, but it was pushed aside by a resolve that was hardening like steel. They had tried to break him, to scare him into giving up. Instead, they'd poured gasoline on a fire they didn't understand, the fire of a soldier's unbreakable spirit. He thought of the generations who had worked this land. He thought of the sacrifices made. He thought of his oath, not just the one to his country, but the unspoken one to his ancestors, to protect this place. He began to prepare, really prepare. He reinforced the doors and windows of his house. He cleared brush from around the house to make a fire break. He rigged up a simple early warning system with tripwires and bells in the woods closest to his home. He slept even less, patrolling his land at odd hours, a silent figure moving through the night. Sarah Hughes, his lawyer, was horrified by the arson. She doubled down on her efforts, trying to find a legal way, any way, to get a restraining order against the developers, but they were too well hidden behind their corporate shields. "They're smart, Arthur," she said, her voice edged with despair. "They use shell corporations, contractors. It's hard to pin anything directly on Henderson or the main company. Then we fight them the way they fight us," Arthur said, his voice quiet but intense. "They want a war for this land, they'll get one. The community, once easily swayed by rumors, now began to see the truth. The sight of the burned-down barn, a local landmark, and the quiet, determined figure of Arthur Jenkins, an old soldier refusing to break, started to change minds. Some neighbors, who'd been distant before, began to stop by, offering quiet words of support, a cup of coffee, a promise to keep an eye out when he had to be away. They too were starting to feel the pressure of a greedy corporation that saw their way of life as just an obstacle. But Horizon Development wasn't finished. The fire was a warning. The next attack, Arthur knew, would likely be more personal, more direct. They had torched his property. They had tried to scare him. Now they would try to remove the obstacle itself, for good. Destroying the barn was a brutal message, but Arthur Jenkins's refusal to back down was an even stronger one back at them. Horizon Development, so used to just rolling over anyone in their way, found itself stuck in a fight that was getting longer and messier than they ever imagined. Their schedule was shot, their local reputation was turning sour, and the cost of their scare tactics was adding up, not just in money, but in unwanted attention. They needed this over with, fast and final. They needed Arthur Jenkins gone. The next attack wasn't on his property, it was on him, and it was calculated, vicious, and meant to be the last one. It happened about a week after the barn fire. Arthur was on one of his irregular patrols, deep in the wooded part of his land, checking the simple tripwire alarms he'd set. The sun was starting to dip, casting long, spooky shadows through the trees. He'd gotten used to the quiet sounds of the forest, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. But this time the snap was too deliberate, the rustle too close. Before he could even think, two figures burst out of the dense undergrowth, moving fast. They were masked, dressed in dark clothes, and armed with heavy clubs. These weren't the clumsy goons from the fence line. These men moved with a chilling, businesslike speed. Arthur, even at his age, reacted with the pure instinct of a combat veteran. No time to reach for the hunting knife he now carried, or his rifle, which was back at the house. He dodged the first swing of a club, feeling the air whistle past his ear. He shot out a foot, catching an attacker on the shin, making him grunt in pain. But there were two of them, and they were younger, stronger. A blow caught him hard on the shoulder, sending a searing pain down his arm. He stumbled, and the second attacker jumped in, a club cracking against his ribs. Arthur gasped, the air knocked out of him. He dropped to one knee, dazed for a second. They closed in, their movements brutal, impersonal. They weren't trying to scare him this time. They were trying to put him down for good. Kicks and blows rained down. He curled up, protecting his head and body as best he could. The pain a roaring fire. Each hit was fresh agony, each breath a struggle. He could hear their grunts as they laid into him. The sickening thud of the clubs. It was savage. Through the haze of pain, a raw survival instinct kicked in. This couldn't be it. Not here. Not like this. With a desperate roar, fueled by adrenaline and pure will, he uncoiled, lashing out with his hands and feet, catching one of his attackers off guard with a kick to the groin. The man howled and doubled over. That bought Arthur a precious second. He scrambled backwards, crab-like, trying to get some space. The other attacker lunged, but Arthur, his vision swimming, saw an opening. He grabbed a fallen branch, thick and heavy, and swung it with every bit of strength he had left. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. The attacker dropped like a sack of rocks, out cold. The first man, still clutching his groin, saw his buddy go down. He looked at Arthur, who was now slowly, painfully, getting to his feet, the branch held like a weapon. Arthur's face was a mask of blood and dirt, his eyes blazing with a terrifying light. The thug hesitated, then, apparently deciding this fight wasn't worth his life, turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he'd shown up. Arthur stood there swaying, every inch of his body screaming. He was battered, bleeding from a cut on his head. His ribs felt broken, his shoulder throbbed. But he was alive, and he was still on his land. He'd fought them off. Again. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself back to the farmhouse. Each step was torture. Once inside, he bolted the door, then collapsed into a chair, his body shaking uncontrollably from the fight and the shock. He knew he needed a doctor, but first, he had to secure himself. He cleaned his wounds as best he could, his movements stiff and agonizing. The cut on his head was deep. His ribs were almost certainly cracked. He was a mess. But his spirit, though battered, was not broken. In fact, it was stronger than ever. This assault, as brutal as it was, made everything crystal clear. These developers, these faceless companies, they would stop at nothing. They would beat an old man, maybe even kill him, to get what they wanted. There were no illusions left. No lawyer could act fast enough to save him now. The cops were either unwilling or unable to really protect him. He was on his own. As he sat there, tending his wounds, a grim determination settled over him. If they wanted an explosive fight, if they wanted to push him to the absolute edge, then fine. He had defended his country in a war far from home. Now he would defend his home in a war brought right to his doorstep. He was a veteran, and he knew how to prepare for a last stand. He spent the next few days in a fog of pain and preparation. He knew they'd be back. They wouldn't leave a job half done, especially now that he could potentially identify one of them, even masked. He was a problem. He fortified his house even more, boarding up some windows, reinforcing others. He gathered every tool, every piece of equipment that could be used as a weapon or a defense. He checked his rifle, his ammunition. He was an old soldier, and the farm was his Alamo. He would not be taken from it. He would not sell. He would not break. He would make them pay for every inch of ground they tried to take. The final showdown was coming. He could feel it in his aching bones, and he would be ready. This fight for one man's land against a faceless corporation? It's a story that plays out in too many places. If you believe people have the right to protect their homes and their heritage, think about supporting organizations that stand up to eminent domain abuse and greedy development. Share Arthur's story. Let your voice be heard. What would you do to protect what's yours? Subscribe for more stories of grit and the unyielding human spirit. The days after the assault were strangely quiet, the calm before a storm he knew was coming. Arthur, mending slowly, moved with a purpose that his injuries couldn't hide. His body ached, every breath a sharp reminder of cracked ribs, but his mind was clear, focused. He knew his attackers, or whoever sent them, wouldn't just give up. They'd failed to scare him, failed to take him out. Now they'd likely try to overwhelm him. He was a loose end, a witness, and a symbol that they couldn't break. Horizon Development couldn't afford any of that. He had little contact with anyone. Sarah, his lawyer, had visited, horrified by his injuries. She pleaded with him to leave, to go somewhere safe, while she tried to kick the legal battle up a notch, maybe even get state authorities involved. But Arthur wouldn't budge. "This is my ground, Sarah," he'd said, his voice raspy but firm as ever. "If I run, they win. Everything my family built, everything I fought for. It means nothing if I surrender now." He was tied to this land. It was his sanctuary, the last piece of his identity. He spent his time methodically. He created a perimeter around the farmhouse, not just with his simple alarms, but with carefully placed obstacles, piles of thorny branches, loose gravel in unexpected spots to make noise. He knew the main ways they'd likely come. He rigged up a system of mirrors in the house to see into blind spots. He saved his energy, ate little, and slept in short, alert bursts in his armchair, the rifle always within reach. He was getting ready for a siege. The nights were the worst. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind in the trees, sounded like footsteps. His war memories, never far from the surface, now played out more vividly. The humid nights in the jungle, the sudden flash of gunfire, the feeling of being surrounded, it all came flooding back. Not as terrifying ghosts, but as grim teachers. He was drawing on every lesson learned, every survival instinct sharpened in that faraway war. Then, one evening, just as twilight was bleeding into darkness, they came. It wasn't a quiet approach. Two heavy-duty pickup trucks, their engines rumbling like a threat, turned off the main road and tore down his long driveway, their headlights cutting through the gloom like accusing eyes. No stealth this time. This was about brute force. Arthur watched from a darkened window, his heart a steady, cold drum. He counted at least 5 figures spilling out of the trucks. They were just silhouettes in the dying light, but they moved with a purpose that screamed bad intentions. Some carried heavy tools, crowbars, sledgehammers. One, he saw with a chill, seemed to be carrying containers, probably more accelerant. They meant to finish the job, burn him out, and wipe away any evidence of what they'd done before. He had one phone call he could make. He dialed Sheriff Brody. "They're here, Brody. At least 5 of them. They look like they mean to burn the house down with me in it." Brody's voice was strained. "Arthur, get out of there if you can. We're on our way, but it'll take us at least 15, maybe 20 minutes. Don't try to be a hero." 15 minutes is a lifetime, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice calm, too calm. "Just get here." He hung up. No time for more. He could hear them outside now, shouting, their voices rough and angry. "Jenkins, we know you're in there, old man. It's over. Come out, or we burn you out." Arthur gripped his rifle. He moved to the reinforced front door, listening. He could hear them trying the knob, then a heavy thud as someone kicked it. The door shuddered but held. His work had been good. Then a crash of glass from the living room window, followed by another. They were breaking in. He pulled back to the central hallway, a narrow space that would funnel them in. He was in the shadows. They'd be framed against the broken windows. A classic defensive spot. The first figure scrambled through a shattered window frame. Arthur didn't hesitate. He aimed low, for the legs. His shot roared in the small space, deafening. The figure screamed, a high-pitched yelp of pain and surprise, and collapsed. "He's got a gun!" A voice yelled from outside, full of panic. "The crazy old bastard is armed!" There was a pause, a moment of shocked silence from his attackers. They hadn't expected this. They probably thought the beating had broken him, or maybe they just figured he wouldn't dare shoot. Then all hell broke loose. Another figure tried to rush the same window, and Arthur fired again. Another cry of pain. He wasn't trying to kill them, not yet. He was trying to wound, to stop them, to make them understand the price of every step they took onto his property, into his home. From outside, he heard a new sound, the sickening splash of liquid, followed by the sharp, unmistakable smell of gasoline. They were dousing the outside walls. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to cut through his focus. His house, his sanctuary, was about to become his tomb. "Burn him out! Burn the whole damn place down!" a voice shrieked, filled with rage and frustration. Arthur knew he had only moments. He couldn't stay inside if the house went up. He had to choose, be trapped by fire, or face them outside. He chose the fight. He saw the first flicker of orange through a window. They'd lit the fuel. Smoke was already starting to creep under the door. This was it, the explosive confrontation his life had been building towards. He took a deep breath, checked his rifle one last time, and braced himself. The time for defense was over. It was time to attack. He would meet them in the heart of the fire. He would not sell his ashes. With the roar of flames getting louder and the nasty smoke stinging his eyes and lungs, Arthur Jenkins knew his choices were just about gone. The crackle of the fire was like a hungry animal eating the wooden walls of his family home. The heat was becoming unbearable. Yet, right in the middle of this inferno, the old soldier's resolve didn't just get harder, it was forged fresh into something that couldn't be broken. He moved towards the back of the house, to a small, sturdy cellar door that led outside. It was less exposed than the front. He could hear his attackers shouting, a mix of anger at his fight and maybe a growing worry as the fire they'd set started to rage out of their control. Taking one last look at the smoke-filled hallway, a silent goodbye to the shell of his memories, Arthur kicked open the cellar door and burst out into the night, not like a victim running away, but like a warrior charging into battle. The scene outside was pure chaos. Flames were already climbing the western wall of the house, throwing a hellish, flickering light across the yard. 2 of the attackers were down, nursing leg wounds, their buddies trying to decide whether to keep attacking or deal with the fire that was quickly getting out of hand. They spun around, startled, as Arthur emerged. A grim figure outlined against the blaze, rifle at the ready. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just advanced. Maybe it was the sight of this old man, beaten and bloodied just days before, now walking out of a burning house. still ready to fight. Maybe it was the raw fury in his eyes, lit by the fire he was stepping out of. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the sudden, piercing wail of multiple sirens, finally getting louder, closer. The remaining attackers, the ones still on their feet, caught between a veteran who refused to die and the cops who were almost there, made their choice. One of them yelled, "Cops, let's get out of here." They scrambled back towards their trucks, dragging their wounded, a messy and panicked retreat. The carefully planned intimidation had fallen apart into a rout. Arthur didn't fire. He watched them go, his stance solid, the heat of his burning house at his back. He stood his ground, among the ashes of what used to be a lone, defiant figure. Sheriff Brody and his deputies arrived to a wild scene, a house engulfed in flames, a battered old veteran standing guard, and the sound of trucks speeding away. Paramedics insisted on treating Arthur. His earlier injuries were worse, and now he had smoke inhalation and minor burns. But his eyes, as they loaded him into the ambulance, were clear. The farmhouse was gone. The building itself, the family treasures, the physical links to his past, all eaten by the fire. But as Arthur sat wrapped in a blanket at the local hospital later that night, watching news reports about the mystery blaze at Rural Farm, he didn't feel beaten. Horizon Group, the developers, immediately put out a statement condemning the violence, denying they had anything to do with it, and saying they were deeply concerned for Mr. Jenkins. But things had changed. The sheer brutality of the attacks, the arson, the final fiery assault, it was too much to just brush off. Investigations were launched, not just by local cops, but by state authorities. The spotlight was now shining right on Horizon Development and how they did business. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be legal battles, rebuilding, and the slow process of healing, both for his body and his spirit. But one thing was certain: Arthur Jenkins had not sold. He had faced their worst, and he was still standing. His home might be ashes, but his legacy, his spirit, and his land, they remained. He had proven that some things, courage, conviction, the love of your heritage, you just can't buy, bully, or burn away. The land was still his, and on its scarred earth, he would, in time, find a way to plant something new. His battle was a testament to the incredible strength of one person's will against impossible odds. A story whispered in the embers, a legend for the generations to come. He had been torched, attacked, but this vet, he wouldn't sell. He had won.